It had been 3 days since the sudden death of Michael Hensley, a man whose quiet presence had been a fixture in the small rural town of Greystone for nearly 2 decades. His passing came without warning, a heart attack in the middle of the night discovered by his wife Claire, who called 911 in a voice that neighbors later described as eerily calm. Now, under the gray sky of a late summer afternoon, she stood at the graveside in a simple black dress, the wind catching at her dark hair. Those who attended the small funeral remembered her posture most of all, straight, almost rigid, her hands clasped in front of her as though holding herself together piece by piece. There were no tears, no trembling, only slow, deliberate movements, as if she were pushing herself through every second by force of will alone. Michael's death had left her untethered in more ways than one. They had no children, and with her parents long gone, her only family was scattered in other states, too far to come quickly. Most in town assumed she would lean on friends or perhaps move closer to relatives once the dust settled. But as the funeral ended and the mourners drifted away, Claire lingered at the gravesite, staring down at the fresh mound of earth. One friend, who had stayed back to collect the last of the flowers, said Claire seemed unaware of the world around her, almost locked in her own private space, until she finally turned and walked toward her car in silence. That evening, the house on Willow Bend Road was quiet. A few neighbors dropped by with leftover food from the wake, leaving foil-covered dishes on the counter. Claire thanked them softly but didn't invite anyone in. Later, a cousin who had driven in for the funeral stopped by to say goodbye before heading home. She told police later that Claire seemed distracted, like she was listening for something else in the house. The cousin left around 8:30. By then, the last traces of daylight had vanished. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of candle wax, and in the living room, a single candle burned near a framed photo of Michael in his work jacket. By all accounts, Claire was last seen around 9 o'clock that night when a neighbor spotted her walking from the front porch into the kitchen. After that, no one saw her again. The following morning, a neighbor grew concerned when the house remained dark and the front door was ajar. Inside, the dishes from the night before were still on the counter. The candle had burned down to nothing, leaving a thin trail of wax on the table. In the bedroom, her purse sat on the dresser, her wallet and driver's license inside. Her car keys were on the nightstand. When police arrived, they found no sign of a struggle. Every window was locked from the inside. There was no note, no message, no indication she had planned to leave. Her phone was missing. But calls to her number went straight to voicemail. The back door was unlocked, but there were no footprints in the soft dirt outside, despite a light rain overnight. Officers initially leaned toward the possibility of suicide. Perhaps she had gone to the river a mile from her home. But no shoes, clothing, or any trace of her were found along the banks. By midday, the search widened. Officers canvassed the surrounding woods and fields, but there was nothing. No torn fabric, no disturbed earth, no scent trails for the dogs to follow. Friends and family struggled to reconcile the idea of Claire taking her own life with the woman they knew. She had been grieving, yes, but she had also been practical, making arrangements for the estate, speaking about the future, even mentioning she might finally visit her sister in Montana. One detail, small but strange, began to trouble the lead investigator. The house showed every sign of having been lived in the night before, yet there was a sense of sudden interruption, as if something had stopped Claire mid-thought, mid-movement. The kettle on the stove was half filled with water, but unheated. A book lay open on the arm of the couch, a folded page marking her place. Even the candle's placement seemed deliberate, as if she'd been planning to sit there a while. By the second day, any assumption of a voluntary disappearance was starting to fray. The total absence of evidence, the lack of tracks, no sightings, no digital trail, was unnerving. Even the most rational minds in the department were uneasy. Missing persons cases usually leave breadcrumbs. Here, there was nothing. In the weeks to come, those last hours after the funeral would become the most dissected in the case file. Who, if anyone, came to the house after the cousin left? Why had she left the back door unlocked? And if she had simply walked away, why had she taken nothing with her? Not her car, not her ID, not even her shoes. Whatever happened to Claire Hensley began in the quiet shadow of her husband's grave and ended somewhere beyond the reach of her small town, leaving behind only an untouched home and a darkness no one could explain. The unanswered question, how a woman could vanish so completely in her own home without a single trace, would be the one that kept the case alive long after the official search began to fade. And for the investigators, it was only the beginning of a disappearance that would grow stranger with every passing day. By the morning after Claire Hensley's disappearance was reported, the quiet rhythm of Greystone was broken. The sheriff's department called in every available deputy, and within hours, the narrow roads leading to Willow Bend were lined with squad cars and trucks loaded with search equipment. Volunteers showed up in worn work boots and rain jackets, some carrying flashlights, others with binoculars. Search dogs were brought in from a neighboring county, their handlers walking slow, deliberate lines through the tall grass behind Claire's house, then into the dense tree line where the forest began to swallow the light. The first day ended with nothing but silence. No scent trail for the dogs, no disturbed ground, no torn fabric snagged on a fence. On the second day, the search area widened, moving into old barns and sheds that hadn't been touched in years. Dusty tools and rusted farm equipment stood frozen in place, untouched by anyone who might have been hiding. Helicopters scanned from above, sweeping the edges of the river with thermal imaging cameras, but no heat signatures appeared. Even the water, cold and murky after recent rains, revealed nothing when divers went down. Every missing person search starts with hope. In the early hours, there's a belief, almost an unspoken pact, that the person is still alive, just lost or hurt and waiting to be found. But as the days passed, that hope began to thin. Claire's trail ended before it began. Her car remained in the driveway, her purse and wallet in the bedroom, her keys on the nightstand. The only items in the house that seemed to catch the investigators' attention were a half-burned candle in the bedroom and a sealed envelope on the dresser, her late husband's military pension letter, unopened since it had arrived just 2 days before the funeral. The candle was ordinary, the kind you could buy in any store, but it was placed in an unusual spot, on the edge of the bedroom dresser, not in the living room where she had been last seen. It gave the impression of a moment interrupted, like she had gone to light it for some reason but never finished. The pension letter raised questions too. Was she avoiding opening it because she didn't want to face what it contained, money that might have symbolized moving on, or had she never gotten the chance? Day after day, the teams pushed further out. They walked the overgrown tracks of the abandoned railway that ran a half-mile from her home, checking the rusting freight cars that still sat there, forgotten by time. They dragged sections of the river, scanning for anything that could have been carried downstream. Every tip from the public was followed up. A figure seen walking along County Road 8, a stranger asking for directions at a gas station, a woman with dark hair spotted near the bus depot. None of them turned out to be Claire. By the 10th day, the mood had shifted. Volunteers who had been there daily began to drop off, their places taken by fewer and fewer fresh faces. The helicopters were grounded to save resources. The last organized push happened on day 15. That morning, the searchers worked the far edges of the mapped area, trudging through marshy fields and tangles of briars that cut at their arms and legs. It was the kind of terrain that would have left clear signs of passage if anyone had walked through it. They found nothing, not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, not even the remains of a campfire. The absence of evidence left the case teetering between two possibilities, neither of them comforting: that Claire had been taken quickly, without a struggle, by someone who knew exactly how to avoid leaving a trace, or that she had walked away entirely of her own accord and disappeared into a life no one in Greystone knew she had prepared. When the official search wound down, the sheriff announced they would continue to follow leads as they came in, but in reality, the farmhouse on Willow Bend grew dark and still. That stillness became its own presence in the town. Weeks later, people still slowed their cars as they passed, glancing at the drawn curtains. Rumors began to bloom in the spaces the truth had left behind. Some said she had been drowning in debt after Michael's death and fled before it caught up to her. Others whispered she never returned from the funeral at all, that maybe the last person to see her alive wasn't telling the full story. A few claimed she'd been talking to someone in secret in the weeks before her husband died. In the absence of hard facts, these theories fed on themselves, shifting with each retelling. But the one thing no one could answer, the thing that kept her case open in the sheriff's office, was how a woman could disappear so completely from a home in the middle of a town where everybody knew her name. And somewhere, behind all the speculation, there was the unshakable feeling that someone out there did know what happened, and had chosen to keep it hidden. The pension letter remained in the evidence file, unopened, its contents unread. The candle was tagged and stored, its wick frozen in the last moment it had burned. Both sat in the same box, quiet reminders of the life that had stopped without warning. And in the stillness that followed the end of the search, the questions about Claire Hensley's fate only grew sharper, waiting for the day when something, anything, might surface to break the silence. The days after the official search ended brought a different kind of investigation, one that didn't involve trudging through swamps or flying low over the river, but instead peeling back the layers of Claire Hensley's life. On the surface, she had been the image of a quiet, small-town widow, managing grief as best she could. But detectives soon began to notice inconsistencies, small pieces of information that didn't fit the simple picture of a woman overwhelmed by loss. The first came from a review of her bank records. Just 48 hours before Michael's funeral, Claire had walked into her local branch and withdrawn nearly $15,000 in cash. It was more than she typically touched in a year, and the teller remembered her as calm, polite, but in a hurry. She had refused a cashier's check, insisting on physical bills. The money was never seen again. No deposits in another bank, no large purchases in the days before she vanished. She hadn't paid off any debts, booked travel, or made any obvious preparations for a trip. If she had hidden it somewhere, no one would have found it in the house. Investigators began to wonder, was the withdrawal connected to her disappearance, or was it meant for something entirely separate? Then there were the phone calls. Several friends, when re-interviewed, mentioned an odd pattern in the weeks leading up to Michael's death. Claire's phone would ring, and she would glance at the screen, her expression tightening, before silencing it without answering. If she was at the diner with friends or at church, she would step outside to decline the call rather than ignore it in front of anyone. One friend recalled overhearing her tell someone in a low voice, "I told you not to call me here," before hanging up abruptly. The number was never shared, and records showed it was from a prepaid cell phone, registered to no one. The strangeness deepened when a former co-worker from her days at a supply warehouse came forward. She hadn't been in touch with Claire in years, but had reached out when she saw the missing person flyers. Over the phone with police, she recounted something Claire had said years earlier after an unexpected encounter with a man at the store. According to the co-worker, Claire had seemed rattled and told her, "He's back. I don't know what he wants, but I know it won't be good." She didn't elaborate, and the co-worker never pushed. At the time, it had seemed like a personal drama. Now, it sounded like a warning. Detectives tried to piece together who he might have been. They dug into her life before Greystone, before Michael, but Claire's early years were quiet. Small-town roots, a brief move to the city in her 20s, and then her return after marrying Michael. Still, there was a gap, 3 years in her early 30s where her paper trail seemed unusually thin. She'd held no official jobs, left no clear address, and filed no tax returns. It was during this gap, they suspected, that the seeds of whatever trouble she feared may have been planted. Despite the unsettling hints, nothing connected directly to the night she vanished. The $15,000 withdrawal suggested planning, yet her car, ID, and belongings had all been left behind. If she had intended to flee, she hadn't taken the tools she would need to survive off the grid. Her bank account sat untouched after her disappearance, the balance exactly the same as it had been the day she walked out of the bank with the cash. And if someone else had taken her, they had left no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA. This combination of preparation and abrupt absence made the case even harder to read. One detective, reviewing the files late at night, noted in his report that we may be dealing with a voluntary disappearance interrupted by a third party. In other words, perhaps Claire had been trying to vanish on her own terms, but someone got to her before she could. As these findings trickled into the public sphere, the rumors in town began to shift. The narrative of the grieving widow became entangled with talk of hidden money, mysterious phone calls, and a shadow from her past. Some whispered that she had been hiding from a dangerous man for years and that Michael's death had removed her last layer of protection. Others thought she might have been involved in something illicit herself and that the cash was payment for a deal gone wrong. None of it could be proven. Every lead hit the same wall. No sightings, no trace of the missing money, no activity on her accounts. The only certainty was that Claire Hensley had secrets that may have followed her into whatever happened that night. And if those secrets were the reason she was gone, it meant someone else out there might still be holding the answers, keeping them buried for a reason that had yet to surface. For the detectives, it was no longer just a question of where she had gone. It was becoming a question of who she had been all along, and that question, they knew, could lead them either closer to finding her or deeper into a mystery with no way out. For weeks, the case had been running in circles, cold trails, dead leads, unanswered questions, until a voice from just across the street broke the monotony. Mrs. Evelyn Lathrop, 81 years old and mostly housebound, called the sheriff's office one afternoon and said she'd remembered something from the night Claire vanished. It wasn't much, she admitted, but it had been nagging at her for days. She told them she had seen Claire that night, sometime after the porch light went off at the Hensley house, walking down the road in the direction of the old railway line. The detail that stood out most was her clothing, a long, dark coat, buttoned all the way to the top, despite the fact it had been a warm August night. Mrs. Lathrop said she almost called out to her but decided against it. Claire's posture was tense, her stride purposeful, as if she had somewhere she needed to be and didn't want to be stopped. The tip had been overlooked at first. By the time Mrs. Lathrop spoke up, nearly 2 weeks had passed and the official search had already wound down. The railway she mentioned hadn't been in operation for decades, the tracks long removed, leaving only weathered wooden ties and patches of rusted metal scattered among weeds. Still, the detail was enough to pull investigators back into the field. If Claire had gone that way, they wanted to know why. When they reached the spot, the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and creosote from the old ties. Graffiti covered the shells of abandoned freight cars that sat derelict on a side spur, their metal sides faded and peeling. The ground was uneven, with long grass hiding jagged scraps of debris. There was no clear sign anyone had been there recently. No fresh footprints, no cigarette butts, no scraps of cloth caught on the rusting ladders. But the remoteness of the place made it easy to see why someone might choose it for a secret meeting. From the edge of town, it was a 15-minute walk, far enough to be out of sight but close enough to reach quickly on foot. As they stood among the decaying remnants of the railway, the detectives began to talk through possibilities. Could she have been meeting someone there? The coat in summer heat suggested she might have been concealing something, money, papers, or perhaps simply trying not to be recognized. And then there was the theory that had begun circulating among some of the locals, the idea that people still used those tracks for illegal freight hopping. Though official trains no longer passed through Greystone, the regional line to the north still had freight traffic, and transients occasionally cut across the abandoned spur to catch a ride. If Claire had planned to disappear, boarding an unscheduled freight under cover of darkness would have left no immediate trace, but that possibility came with its own set of problems. Freight riding wasn't something one stumbled into by accident. It required planning, timing, and often help from someone who knew the schedule. Investigators could find no evidence that Claire had been in contact with anyone connected to the rail yard in years. And if she had intended to leave, why bring nothing with her? No suitcase, no visible bag, no indication she was carrying anything other than what could fit under that coat. Still, Mrs. Lathrop's account gnawed at the detectives. Witnesses in missing persons cases often misremember, confuse dates, or unintentionally exaggerate details. But the image of Claire walking with determination toward a place no one had reason to go was difficult to dismiss. The path she would have taken cut past an old loading dock, now overgrown with weeds. Behind it was a gap in the fence large enough for a person to slip through. Beyond that point, it was open ground to the freight cars. If she had been meeting someone, that was the most likely spot. When they canvassed the area again, They spoke with a handful of locals who admitted that the railway had become a kind of unofficial meeting point for people who wanted privacy. Teenagers, drifters, or those conducting business they didn't want to see. One man, who lived in a camper not far from the tracks, swore he'd heard voices out there late that same night. He couldn't say whether it was Claire, but he remembered the sound of laughter followed by what he described as a sharp argument before silence fell. The problem was that all of this was circumstantial, glimpses and sounds without proof, shadows without substance. No one could say for certain whether Claire had reached the railway or if something happened to her along the way. But the very fact that Mrs. Lathrop had waited so long to speak up left an uncomfortable gap in the timeline. If her account was accurate, it meant Claire had left her home alive and of her own volition, heading somewhere that night with a clear purpose. And that suggested her disappearance wasn't the work of an intruder breaking into her home, but something that happened after she stepped willingly into the darkness. For the investigators, the railway became a point of fixation, not because it offered hard evidence, but because it offered the first new direction in a case that had been frozen in place. And in that kind of case, sometimes even the smallest direction could become the thread that unravels everything. It was 3 months to the day since Claire Hensley had vanished when the call came in from a small-town police department across the state line. A desk clerk at a roadside motel claimed to have checked in a woman who matched the description from the missing person flyer. Same height, same dark hair, same slender build. She'd used cash, provided no ID, and signed the registry with a name that meant nothing to anyone. The clerk hadn't thought much of it at the time, but later, while scrolling the news, he came across Claire's story online. The resemblance, he insisted, was undeniable. Detectives from Greystone made the drive, clinging to a flicker of hope. If it was her, if she had survived, they might finally have the answers that had eluded them. The motel itself was the kind of place people stopped at when they didn't want to be noticed. Faded signage, a half-empty parking lot, and a single clerk on duty overnight. The security camera above the lobby door had caught her arrival, but the footage was grainy, washed in the yellow haze of bad lighting. The figure was the right height, the hair the right length and color, but the image was too soft to make a positive ID. She moved quickly, head down, one hand in the pocket of a long coat despite the mild weather. By the time local police checked the room, she was gone. She'd checked out early, slipping away before sunrise. There was no luggage, no discarded clothing, not even a receipt left in the wastebasket. The bed had been slept in, but the sheets were barely rumpled, as if she'd spent more time sitting at the small table than lying down. And on that table, folded neatly beside the room phone, was a single object, a clipping from a decades-old newspaper. It was an article about a missing child from 1986, a case that had long faded from public memory. The story was short. A 7-year-old boy had disappeared from a campground in the next state over, last seen walking toward the lake before dinner. Despite extensive searches, no trace was ever found. The clipping was worn and yellowed, the edges softened as if it had been handled many times. At first glance, it made no sense. The boy's family name didn't match Claire's, nor her husband's. There was no connection between the small lakeside town where the child vanished and Greystone, no shared relatives or acquaintances. Local officers assumed it was a coincidence. Perhaps the woman had been a friend of the boy's family, or perhaps she simply carried it for reasons of her own. But for the Greystone investigators, the find felt deliberate. People didn't hold on to something like that for 37 years without a reason. They began digging into the old case, tracking down anyone still alive who had been connected to it. The boy's parents were both gone, but an uncle remembered a teenage babysitter who had looked after him in the summers. Her name wasn't Claire, it wasn't even close, but she had been in her early 20s at the time, living in the same region where Claire had spent those undocumented years in her 30s. There were no photographs to compare, no direct proof, but the possibility was enough to set the investigators on edge. The idea that Claire's disappearance might be tied to something far older than her husband's death began to take shape. If she was the same woman from that decades-old case, what had she been running from? And why would she resurface only to vanish again? There was a theory, whispered in the squad room but never written down, that the truth about the missing child had never been told, and that Claire, if she was indeed that babysitter, knew exactly what had happened. But if that was true, then her disappearance in Greystone might not have been random. It could have been the final step in a much longer chain of events, the end result of secrets kept for decades. Maybe someone else from that past had found her. Maybe the person who had taken that boy had decided Claire knew too much. Whatever the case, the trail went cold again almost as soon as it appeared. No one matching her description checked into another motel under that name. No new sightings surfaced. The clipping was logged into evidence, sealed in a plastic sleeve, its meaning still a mystery. For the investigators, it was a cruel twist, proof that she might still be alive, paired with the certainty that she was still out of reach. In the weeks that followed, the image of that grainy figure haunted the lead detective. He would replay the footage late at night, studying the way she moved, the slight turn of her head toward the clerk as she passed. It was familiar in a way that made his chest tighten. If it was her, she had been right there, alive, unhurt, just beyond their grasp. And if it wasn't her, then someone else out there was carrying around the memory of a child who had vanished into the dark, for reasons no one could yet understand. Either way, the clipping had turned the investigation on its head. Now it was no longer just about where Claire Hensley had gone, but about what had really happened all those years ago by the lake, and that question, once asked, would be impossible to put back to rest. The lead that shifted the entire tone of the investigation didn't come from the police at all. It came from the dogged persistence of an investigative journalist named Mark Ellery. Ellery had been following Claire's disappearance since the day it made the regional news, fascinated not only by the mystery itself, but by the strange undercurrent of details that never seemed to fit. He wasn't from Greystone, and that gave him an advantage. He could knock on doors without the weight of small-town politics pressing back. After months of digging, he managed to get his hands on a set of private employment and pension records for Michael Hensley, Claire's late husband. At first glance, they showed nothing out of the ordinary. Decades as a freight yard worker, retirement paperwork filed just 2 years before his death. But buried deep in the records was a note from a federal agency, coded and understated, referencing Michael's cooperation in an investigation in the early 2000s. Ellery kept pulling. He spoke to retired colleagues, former yard managers, anyone who might remember the details. Slowly, a picture emerged. Michael had been a quiet man, not known for taking risks, but during his final years at the yard, he had been quietly feeding information to federal agents. The target was a smuggling ring, using freight shipments to move stolen goods, narcotics, and according to one source, something even more dangerous, illegally obtained firearms. The ring was never fully dismantled. A handful of arrests were made, but some of the suspected leaders slipped away before indictments could be filed. When Ellery passed the information to police, the implications were immediate and troubling. If Michael had kept those connections hidden from most of the people in his life, including possibly his wife, then who else had known? And if Claire had known, whether through confession or by accident, her disappearance might not have been random. It could have been calculated. The question no one wanted to voice at first was whether Michael's death had really been the natural end of a worn heart, or whether it had been arranged. His passing had been ruled a heart attack after a routine autopsy. No foul play suspected, no signs of trauma. But now, with this new information, that certainty began to fracture. If he had been eliminated to keep certain truths buried, then Claire's sudden disappearance only months later might have been the final act in silencing them both. The sheriff's office authorized the reopening of Michael's autopsy file. But nearly a year had passed since his burial, and the physical evidence that could have confirmed or disproved foul play had degraded. The tissue samples preserved in the lab were limited and too compromised to yield anything conclusive. Toxicology had not been extensive at the time, and now it was too late to run deeper tests. What they were left with was a cloud of suspicion and no way to pierce it. In Greystone, the revelations about Michael's past spread quietly at first, then more openly, with the half-whispered certainty that always comes when something dangerous brushes against a small town. Some saw him as a man who had quietly done the right thing and paid the price for it. Others wondered if his cooperation had been more complicated, if he had made deals to protect himself that had ultimately put Claire in the crosshairs. The truth was that no one knew how much she had been told, but if she had carried any of that knowledge, it could explain why she'd been receiving those strange phone calls and why she might have been meeting someone at the abandoned railway the night she vanished. One theory began to take root among the investigators. If the smuggling ring, or remnants of it, had learned that Claire knew something incriminating, they could have been watching her from the moment Michael died. The $15,000 cash withdrawal before the funeral might not have been the first step in a plan to run. It could have been payment demanded by someone holding her under threat. Perhaps she had paid, and they had taken her anyway. Or perhaps she never had the chance to hand it over. The frustrating part was that every time they tried to follow the thread, it broke in their hands. The men believed to have been at the center of the ring had either disappeared entirely or reinvented themselves far from Greystone. The old case files were heavily redacted, names blacked out, details blurred beyond use. And yet, the timing of Michael's death and Claire's disappearance was impossible to ignore. Even without hard proof, the new angle reframed the entire case. It was no longer just a mystery about a grieving widow who had vanished without warning. It was now tethered to a dangerous history, to people capable of erasing others without a trace. The thought that both Michael and Claire might have been swept off the map to protect secrets from 20 years ago gave the investigation a darker edge. But without forensic evidence to back it, it remained only a theory. And in a case already filled with shadows, theories alone weren't enough to bring anyone to justice. Still, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened to Michael in life had reached forward, months after his death, to take Claire as well. And if that was true, it meant the danger hadn't ended. It had simply gone back underground, waiting. For a while, the search for Claire Hensley burned hot. There were news segments, radio interviews, and volunteer search parties in bright vests pushing through the overgrown edges of Greystone's outskirts. But time has a way of wearing down even the most determined efforts, and slowly, inevitably, the fire begins to fade. By the second anniversary of her disappearance, the sheriff's office had no new evidence, no verified sightings, and no fresh leads that didn't crumble on first contact. The case was quietly shifted from active investigation to a cold file, though no one said the words out loud. The Hensley farmhouse stood empty for nearly 3 years before it was finally sold. The new owners gutted the place, painting over the faded wallpaper Claire had chosen herself, tearing up the worn carpet in the bedroom where that half-burned candle had once been found. Neighbors said it felt like erasing her all over again. The few belongings left behind were boxed and sent to distant relatives who rarely spoke to the press. Whatever trace of Claire had once lingered in that house was gone by the time the renovations were complete. Not long after, Mrs. Evelyn Lathrop, the elderly neighbor who had given that late haunting account of seeing Claire walking toward the old railway, passed away in her sleep. With her went the last living witness to Claire's movements on that final night. Her small, weathered house was sold off too, the curtains that had once been her watchpoint now drawn shut for good. In the years that followed, Greystone learned to live with the absence. Claire's name was still known, but it was no longer spoken daily. It came up only in the kinds of quiet conversations that take place in the back booths of diners or on slow evenings when old stories resurface. Newcomers to the town would hear it eventually, usually from someone leaning over a coffee cup, lowering their voice just enough to make the telling feel conspiratorial. They'd hear about the widow who vanished after her husband's funeral, about the unexplained cash withdrawal, about the neighbor's sighting at the railway. But like all small-town ghost stories, it became part of the landscape, more folklore than investigation. Every few years, a tip would come in, often from far beyond Greystone. A waitress in Arizona swore she served a woman who looked just like Claire, sitting alone at the end of the counter, nervously glancing at the door. A street musician in Seattle claimed he'd seen her playing guitar on a busy sidewalk, though he couldn't recall the song. Each time, detectives would make the calls, sometimes even travel out to check, only to find the trail ending in yet another dead end. The Arizona woman was a retired schoolteacher who had never been east of New Mexico. The Seattle musician was chasing a memory from years earlier, and his description shifted each time he told it. By the 7th year, many of the original detectives had retired or moved on. The case files, now thick with reports and false leads, were boxed and archived in the evidence room, stacked alongside dozens of other cold cases. In the margins of those files were the quiet frustrations of the investigators who had once carried the case. Notes about doors that closed too quickly, about witnesses who changed their stories, about theories that felt right but couldn't be proven. Some pages bore faint coffee stains, others the smudge of a fingerprint from an officer who had handled them one too many times. For the families of the missing, time is not a healer. It's a weight. Each year without answers makes the questions heavier, the possibilities darker. The few relatives Claire still had in contact with the sheriff's office stopped calling as often, not because they no longer cared, but because they had learned the rhythm of disappointment. Her sister in Montana once said that she still picked up the phone expecting it to be Claire, but after a decade, even that reflex had dulled. Greystone itself changed in small ways. The railway tracks near where Mrs. Lathrop had seen her were finally pulled up completely, the rotting ties hauled away. A small walking path was laid over the old line, erasing yet another physical link to that night. The old freight cars were cut up for scrap. The place where police had once imagined she might have met someone was now just another stretch of town where joggers passed without a second thought. The passage of time didn't just erode the evidence, it reshaped the memory of the case. For younger residents who had never known Claire, she became a story told in the same breath as local legends about the haunted mill or the fishing boat that sank without a trace. The difference, of course, was that Claire had been real. There had been a house, a funeral, a night when she was flesh and blood and breathing, and then there hadn't. Now and then, one of the original investigators would be asked about the case in an interview or at a community event. The answer was always the same. There was no closure, no definitive theory that could be proven. Some leaned toward the idea that she had run to escape something from her past. Others believed she had been taken by force. But without a body, without confirmed sightings, everything remained speculation. By the 11th year, most of Greystone had stopped expecting the truth to surface. The case's once vivid details had faded into the sort of muted memory that exists only in the quiet corners of people's minds, until the day something impossible happened. Something so small, so ordinary on its own, yet so impossible in the context of the case that it pulled Claire's name out of the shadows and thrust it back into the center of every conversation in town. It would arrive in the most unexpected way, on the hand of a stranger who had no idea the ring they were wearing had once belonged to a woman the town had all but given up on finding. It was late on a Thursday afternoon when the call came into the sheriff's office, one of those calls that sounded, at first, like it would be nothing. A retired teacher named Ruth Madsen had been in a grocery store 2 towns over, waiting in line at the checkout. Ahead of her stood a woman in her late 20s, chatting idly with the cashier. Ruth wouldn't have noticed her at all, except that when the woman reached into her purse to pull out her wallet, the light caught on a gold band around her left ring finger. It wasn't just the color or the size that caught Ruth's attention. It was the engraving, visible in the brief moment before the woman's hand turned. 3 small letters and a word she knew by heart. C and M, always. The inscription had been part of Claire Hensley's wedding ring. Ruth knew this because, back when Claire and Michael were married, she had been close enough to see it during potlucks and church events. She'd even heard the story of how Michael had insisted on having the engraving done before their wedding, saying it was their promise in metal. The ring had been listed among Claire's personal effects when she vanished, but it had never been recovered from the house or found in any of the search areas. Ruth didn't approach the woman. Instead, she followed her to the parking lot, watching as she loaded her groceries into a beat-up sedan and drove away. The plates were from out of county, but Ruth didn't get the full number. What she did do was go home and call the sheriff's office, explaining every detail she could remember about the encounter. When detectives tracked down the woman, she was cooperative, but baffled by the attention. She said she'd bought the ring from a pawn shop in a city 3 hours away. She'd chosen it, she explained, because she liked the weight of it, and because the engraving felt romantic, even though she had no idea who C and M were. She still had the receipt, dated just under 3 months earlier. The pawn shop was in a rough part of the city, the kind of place where items moved quickly and questions were asked only when required by law. The owner remembered the ring. He said it had come in from a man in his late 40s or early 50s, tall, lean, with weathered hands and a faded freight yard uniform jacket. He hadn't given a name, hadn't shown ID, claiming he'd forgotten his wallet but insisting he needed the cash quickly. Normally, the shop would have refused the transaction without identification, but the owner admitted that he'd bent the rules because the man seemed desperate. He'd handed over a small wad of bills, taken the ring, and the man had walked out into the drizzle without looking back. That detail, the jacket, hit the investigators harder than anything else. Freight yard uniforms weren't uncommon, but in the context of Claire's case, they carried a chilling weight. Michael Hensley had spent his career in the freight yard. It had been central to his work, and later to the secret cooperation with federal agents that had come to light after Claire vanished. The smuggling ring he'd helped expose had used freight lines extensively. A man wearing that uniform, selling Claire's missing wedding ring over a decade later, could be nothing more than coincidence, but it could also mean the past had finally bled into the present. The pawn shop's security system was outdated, but the owner kept the recordings for several months. They managed to pull the footage from the day the ring came in. The quality was poor, but it was enough to make out the man's build, his cautious way of scanning the street before entering, the way he kept his head down during the transaction. He didn't appear to know he was being recorded, but he also never gave the camera a clear view of his face. He was in and out in under 3 minutes. Investigators ran the description against employment records from nearby rail yards but came up empty. Most of the men fitting that age and build were either dead, retired, or still working under legitimate credentials. The lead detective couldn't shake the idea that this man had been keeping the ring for years before deciding to sell it, and that decision might not have been voluntary. Rings were intimate things. People didn't just happen upon them, not ones engraved with personal inscriptions. They were given, stolen, or taken from someone who no longer had use for them. The reappearance of the ring reawakened the case in a way that nothing else had in years. It was proof that at least one part of Claire's life, or death, was still out there, moving through hands crossing distances. It suggested that somewhere, someone had access to her belongings long after the night she disappeared. Whether that someone had been with her in her final hours, or had simply come into possession of her things later, was a question that now burned at the center of the investigation. In the weeks that followed, the sheriff's office released a statement asking for the public's help in identifying the man from the pawn shop footage. They received dozens of calls, but every single one fizzled. Some swore it was a drifter they'd seen near the rail yards. Others claimed it was a retired worker from a neighboring county. None of the tips produced a match. For the people of Greystone, the discovery was as unsettling as it was hopeful. After more than a decade of silence, Claire's story had a new thread, something tangible to pull on. But the fact that it had appeared in such an ordinary, almost accidental way only deepened the unease. If the ring could surface in a grocery store after 11 years, what else was out there, tucked away in someone's pocket or drawer, holding pieces of a truth no one had been able to reach? In the evidence locker, the ring was sealed in a small plastic bag, tagged and cataloged. Its surface still bore faint scratches from years of wear, and the engraving, C&M, always, remained clear, the gold warmed slightly by the touch of those who had handled it. To the detectives who had been there since the beginning, it felt less like an artifact and more like a message, one that had taken over a decade to be delivered. The question now was whether it was a breadcrumb leading toward answers, or a warning that whoever had been involved still had the power to decide how much of the story would ever be told. The reappearance of Claire Hensley's wedding ring had cracked the case, opened just enough for investigators to breathe life into it again. But as they began retracing its path from the pawn shop, it quickly became clear that the ring had not traveled in a straight line. Pawn shops by nature are middle points, places where objects change hands without the burden of questions. When detectives pressed the shop owner, he admitted that the man in the freight yard jacket wasn't the only person who'd brought items in recently with a similar, weathered look. Jewelry, watches, tools, even a few faded photographs. He didn't keep much record beyond a rough physical description of each seller, but he did keep one thing, a handwritten log of where certain sellers claimed to have gotten their merchandise. On that list, the man who had sold Claire's ring was marked with a note, "Came from the East Ridge Line." The East Ridge Line was the name locals used for the abandoned railway corridor that cut through miles of forest and farmland, running parallel to where Mrs. Lathrop had once seen Claire walking the night she vanished. It was a detail too sharp to ignore. Detectives started working outward, talking to other second-hand dealers within a 100-mile radius. They learned that over the past 2 years, a small, transient group had been moving through the area. Train-hopping drifters who followed freight lines, sleeping in empty cars or in makeshift camps near old rail yards. They were tight-knit, protective of each other, and hard to pin down. Most used nicknames, few gave real surnames. And almost all had passed through East Ridge at some point. When investigators finally caught up to a pair of them behind a service station on the edge of a neighboring county, the conversation was slow to start. The men claimed they didn't know anything about a wedding ring. But one, a wiry man in his 40s with a weathered face and an easy but guarded smile, eventually admitted that he'd heard of a gold ring with an inscription passing through their circle. According to him, it had come from an old trunk in the woods. A trunk, he said, that had been hidden so well it would have been missed if someone hadn't been looking for it. He wouldn't say exactly where the trunk was, only that it was not far from the tracks and off the beaten path enough to keep it safe for a long time. When pressed, the man's tone shifted. He said the trunk belonged to someone you don't mess with, and that anyone who'd taken it without permission was taking a risk they wouldn't survive. The way he said it wasn't a threat exactly, but a matter-of-fact statement of reality. He claimed not to know the man's name, just that he was older, traveled alone, and had a history in the freight yards. The detectives immediately thought of Michael Hensley's past, his ties to the smuggling ring, his work on the inside. If the trunk had once belonged to someone from that world, then its contents might be more than just a stash of pawnable items. It could be evidence, or worse, it could be trophies. But without a location, they were stuck. The drifter refused to lead them there, insisting he wasn't going to get on the bad side of a man who's still alive and knows where you sleep. They dug deeper into the network, piecing together sightings and stories from other travelers. A few remembered seeing the man in question, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with gray hair, always carrying an old canvas duffel, often wearing jackets with faded railroad insignias. He never stayed in one place long, and he was always careful about what he carried in and out of camp. One woman claimed she'd seen him cleaning out a metal trunk near a thicket, muttering to himself before locking it shut and disappearing into the trees. The problem was that in the drifter's world, there was a kind of code. Information only flowed when it benefited someone directly, and trust was currency. Outsiders, especially law enforcement, were always at a disadvantage. The moment detectives pushed too hard, the group would scatter and whatever tenuous lead they had would be gone. Despite the lack of cooperation, the investigators began to believe the trunk story wasn't just a cover. The geography fit, the proximity to the abandoned railways, the isolation of the wooded areas around East Ridge. If the man had been using that corridor for years, he could have hidden belongings there without anyone stumbling across them. And if those belongings had once included Claire's wedding ring, the question was whether they'd been hers in life, taken from her after her disappearance, or acquired through some secondary connection. It was here that suspicion circled back to the idea that her husband's past had never truly let her go. If this man had ties to the smuggling ring Michael once helped expose, he might have held on to items connected to both of them, either as leverage, as keepsakes, or as reminders of unfinished business. That possibility carried a darker implication, that Claire's disappearance might have been deliberate retaliation, a message to someone else who knew too much. Without enough evidence to charge anyone or seize property, the detectives were left circling the perimeter of the truth without stepping inside. They could feel the shape of the story forming, how the pawnshop ring tied back to the drifters to the trunk, and the trunk to a man whose life brushed up against the Hensleys in ways no one had yet proven. But the law demanded proof, and proof was exactly what they didn't have. Even so, the lead detective couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, deep in those woods near the old East Ridge line, sat a locked trunk holding the missing years of Claire's life, or the final hours of it. Whether anyone would ever see inside it was another matter entirely, and until they did, the man who owned it would remain a shadow, moving in and out of the edges of the investigation, just close enough to remind them that he was still out there, and still in control of the pieces they couldn't reach. By the time the lead about the wedding ring had run its course, the investigation into Claire Hensley's disappearance had been alive again for almost a year. For the first time in over a decade, there had been something tangible to work with, an object she'd worn every day of her marriage, something that had been missing since the night she vanished, suddenly appearing in the most ordinary of places. But the closer the detectives tried to get to its origin, the more the trail frayed until it dissolved back into the same fog that had swallowed the rest of the case. The ring sat in an evidence locker now, sealed in a clear bag, its gold dulled slightly from years of wear, the inscription still visible. C&M, always. It was, in every practical sense, a breakthrough, and yet it felt like a taunt, an object that said, "I've been here all along," without offering a single clue about how it had gotten from Claire's hand to a pawn shop hundreds of miles away. For the investigators who had worked this case in its early days, it was a reminder of just how close they had come to her before she slipped away again. For the newer detectives, it was a puzzle with too many missing pieces to even begin fitting together. They re-examined the timeline of her last known movements with renewed intensity, trying to map any possible connection between the night she disappeared and the small, transient group of drifters linked to the ring. There were interviews, stakeouts, even discreet searches in the wooded areas along the abandoned freight line. The theory that Claire's body, or at least the rest of her personal belongings, could be hidden somewhere along those tracks became an obsession for some on the team. They envisioned her being lured or forced into one of those remote stretches of forest where the noise of passing trains could mask anything. But no matter how many times they searched, they found nothing. No clothing, no remains, no indication that a grave had ever been dug and covered over. The rail line, overgrown and silent, offered no answers. It was possible, they admitted, that in the years since her disappearance, any trace of her could have been destroyed by weather, scavenging animals, or human hands. The investigative divide deepened. One camp believed she had been killed the night she vanished. In their theory, she had either been taken from her home or intercepted on her way to the railway by someone connected to her husband's past, a person with a reason to erase her and the means to do it cleanly. The cash withdrawal, the long coat in summer, the late-night walk toward an abandoned railway, each detail fit neatly into a picture of a woman who had been coerced or threatened into meeting someone she feared. In this version of events, the ring had stayed in the killer's possession as a kind of twisted trophy before being sold off years later, either out of necessity or carelessness. The other camp leaned toward a different possibility, that Claire had managed to get away that night. That she had been walking toward the railway to meet someone who would help her leave Greystone and disappear from whatever had been closing in on her. In their minds, the $15,000 withdrawal was a survival fund, the coat was concealment, and the years of silence afterward were proof that she had been living off the grid, somewhere far from anyone who knew her name. In this theory, the ring had been sold only after her natural death, her possessions eventually filtering into the second-hand market with no one realizing their significance. The problem was that neither theory could be proved or disproved. The evidence was static, frozen in time. The ring, the trunk in the woods that no one would point them to, the half-dozen rumors that spiraled out of the drifter network, all of it suggested there was still more to the story, but none of it was enough to push the investigation over the edge into resolution. The case file grew thicker again with reports, transcripts, and dead ends. The sheriff's office gave periodic updates to the press, each one careful not to promise too much. They admitted the ring was significant. They admitted they were still pursuing leads. But when asked if they were any closer to finding Claire, their answers became more guarded. Privately, the lead detective, who had been with the department long enough to remember the smell of candle wax in Claire's bedroom on the day she was reported missing, felt the weight of time more than ever. He'd seen other cold cases resolve after decades, often through sheer luck or some small, unexpected tip that unlocked everything. But in those cases, there had been at least one thread they could still pull. Here, every thread seemed to snap as soon as they touched it. In Greystone, the return of Claire's name to the headlines stirred old memories. For some, it brought hope that answers were finally close. For others, it reopened wounds they'd learned to live around. The people who had known her best, those few who still remembered the sound of her voice, the way she carried herself, spoke carefully now, as if guarding the parts of her that hadn't yet been picked apart by speculation. And so the story of Claire Hensley settled back into its uneasy place in the town's collective memory. The farmhouse where she'd lived was on its third set of owners, none of whom liked to talk about the history of the place. The railway path where she'd last been seen had become a recreational trail, joggers and dog walkers passing daily over the ground that might still hold her secrets. The old freight yard jacket described by the pawnshop owner remained a phantom detail, a clue without a name. The ring stayed in the evidence box, a silent witness to a night no one could reconstruct. It was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, yet heavy enough with implication to keep the case open indefinitely. To some in the sheriff's office, it was a symbol of unfinished work. To others, it was a reminder that not every story has an ending that can be told. Over the years, the detectives still assigned to the case learned to live with the frustration. Leads would flare up, a supposed sighting, a found object, a name passed in a hushed conversation, only to burn out in days. The investigation was less a forward march and more a circling pattern, always returning to the same point, that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened to Claire Hensley, and that the wedding ring's journey from her finger to a pawnshop counter was the closest anyone had ever come to finding them. Whether she had died that night along the freight lines or lived quietly in the shadows for years afterward, her absence had become part of the landscape, woven into the identity of Greystone itself. The case remained open, not because anyone truly believed she would walk back into town, but because without answers, closing it would feel like letting her vanish twice. And so, the file stayed on the active shelf, the ring sealed in its bag, waiting for the day when the silence might break, if it ever did. Until then, the disappearance of Claire Hensley remained exactly what it had been since the summer night she walked into the dark, a vanishing within a vanishing, a mystery that refused to give itself away.